Today's Litsoc is on that always compelling literary concept, the idea of the Great American Novel. Now, the idea of the Great American Novel has been around for centuries, ever since the USA became a nation, in fact. Now, it's become so ubiquitous in popular culture, and not just in the USA, because the USA, of course, remains the prime mover and shaker in determining popular culture, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the movies we watch, and, of course, the books we read. If you want any proof of that, just look at recent developments in the Booker Prize, because US books and authors are now eligible for that. In fact, the idea of the Great American Novel has become a bit of a running gag. So on the screen here, we've got a snippet from an episode of The Simpsons, in which Principal Skinner, having lost his job, confides in Bart that he will write the Great American Novel. Now, his idea, of course, is absolutely awful. It's essentially a cheap Jurassic Park knockoff called Billy and the Clonosaurus, which Apu, who is the immigrant, of course, incidentally, trashes him for. The point is that the idea of the Great American Novel, with all the cliches that go with it, has become so ubiquitous that it's become ripe for satire. So it's a phrase that we're all familiar with, but I want to unpack the term a little bit and get to the nub of what it has meant, what it means today, and what it might possibly mean in the future. Now, Wikipedia, which of course is where we all start to get information these days, says that the idea of the Great American Novel, or the GAN, is the concept of a novel of high literary merit that shows the culture at a specific time in the country's history. So let's to unpack that, go into a little bit more detail. It's the idea of course, the American dream. It's the literary version of the American dream. The American dream is the idea that with the underpinning values of freedom and democracy that are in the US Constitution, everyone is afforded the opportunity for prosperity, success, and self-actualization. Now, in saying that novels are the literary equivalent of the American dream, I don't mean the novels are necessarily representatives or champions of the American dream. It's more a critique of the idea of the American dream. It's a measuring of the distance between the aspiration of the American dream and the reality on the ground. In a way, they are symbolic because many argue that the Great American Novel is yet to be written. All of the attendant baggage that comes with the idea of the Great American Novel is impossible to aspire to because the American dream hasn't been realised, and neither, therefore, has the ideal version of the Great American Novel. Certainly not in the sense that Wikipedia says here. Now, there are many reasons for this, but there is one in particular, and that is that the USA is a very young country. You know, it essentially was founded in 1783 with the conclusion of the American War of Independence, so it's got a very short history. It's a former British colony, and as such, it lacks a lot of the traditional and cultural heritage that a lot of other countries do. It's still, you could argue, looking for its own place and identity in the world. It doesn't have millennia or even centuries, really, of tradition, myth, and legend to draw upon in the way that a lot of so-called older countries, such as European and Asian ones do. You know, it hasn't got an Iliad, it hasn't got a Don Quixote or a Paradise Lost, to give some European examples, and it doesn't have the Romance of the Three Kingdoms or a Gilgamesh or the Tale of Genji, to cite some Asian ones. Now, we all know that the USA is a very proud and patriotic nation, and the fact that it is still to arguably realise the Great American Novel is a source of some perhaps shame and embarrassment. All the same, they are trying, and there are some notable examples in the US literary canon that are great literature, but can any of them really be described as truly being the Great American Novel? So, a quick rundown of some of the finer details and tropes that have come to define the Great American Novel. So, first of all, genre fiction, in the classic sense of the word, is generally excluded, as the accepted wisdom is that something that could be easily classified and categorized into a particular type of story is too reductive and simplistic to, encapsulate a national experience, which is what the Great American Novel strives to do. A Great American Novel might have a basis in it, but it would basically be reductive to slap a conventional genre label like sci-fi or crime or romance or fantasy onto it. So that's one thing. Now, that second point there about zeitgeist, what do we mean by zeitgeist? Now, that's a term that comes from the German philosopher Hegel, and crudely speaking, it's the spirit of the age. More precisely, it's the intangible factors that drive the dominant ideologies that sort of define contemporary society. So, to give you an example, right now, we live in a so-called digital age, with social media, and other Web 2.0 technologies, with user-generated content sort of influencing things like political movements, popular culture trends. So, for example, social media influencers rather, and so on. So that's what we mean by zeitgeist. So the Great American Novel should be aiming to capture the zeitgeist. And thirdly, the political and personal overlap in the Great American Novel. A protagonist or a small group of protagonists are the focal points, through which larger political concerns of the time are discussed, and the other way around, and vice versa. They're not mutually exclusive. The personal is the political. Now, whether the issues discussed within the Great American Novels, can be extended out beyond the USA and applied on a global scale, and if so, to what extent, is up for debate. Now, there is no doubt that we will have heard of many of the books that we're going to talk about in a bit, but do they permeate the national and even international consciousness and resonate in an epoch-defining way? Well, perhaps at the end of this talk, you might have a better idea. So we got a map here. Now, this map with many examples of books that are being considered the Great American Novel, is not an exhaustive, definitive list by any means. But it does include many of the ones that are including on lists, classic lists of the classic Great American Novels. We've got a few curveballs on there, perhaps, ones that you might not expect. Now, obviously this, I couldn't possibly talk about all of these, so I'm just going to touch on 4 examples and share how each of the 4 examples I'm going to talk about fulfills the criteria that we discussed before, which of course were transcending genre fiction tags, capturing the zeitgeist of the time, and collapsing the boundary between the personal and political. We'll start at the beginning with what is widely accepted to be the first Great American Novel, Moby Dick. Now, at its most basic level, this is a story of one man, Captain Ahab, and his obsession with gaining revenge on the big white whale, Moby Dick, that took his leg. But there is quite a bit more to it than that. So if we apply those tropes that I talked about one by one to Moby Dick, now, transcending genre, it is an adventure story, a doomed adventure story, but it is an adventure story of a life at sea. But the narrative, Ishmael, the main character, his narrative is far from being a straightforward one. There's lots of digressions into, among other things, sermons, stage plays, and most famously, or infamously, depending on how you view it, essays that detail the anatomy of whales. Now, these digressions can be really a bit of a slog to read, and they can slow the story down, but they are devices that actually enrich the narrative, and they allow Herman Melville, the author, to delve into deep philosophical questions, such as theological arguments for the existence of God and the nature of good and evil. Shakespeare, the influence of Shakespeare is writ very large over Moby Dick. There are soliloquies, stage directions appear, but also there are direct references to his plays. So, for instance, there's a section where Ishmael is apparently just merely listing the different types of whales, but actually it directly echoes Macbeth's speech shortly after Lady Macbeth's death. The one about life's but a walking shadow. It is told by an idiot, full of sand and fury, signifying nothing. It deliberately echoes that within the narrative. So that's not just done for the sake of it. That soliloquy by Macbeth, it's almost like a nihilistic meditation on life. And by putting it in the narrative here, it sort of foreshadows the catastrophe that is about to befall the crew of the ship that Ishmael sails on. Now, when it comes to capturing the zeitgeist, we've already alluded to it being something of an adventure story. Now, we have to sort of we've got to make sure we don't apply our 21st century values here, because at the time, whale hunting was very heavily romanticized as a thing for a young man who's seeking adventure and fortune and tropical paradises to do. It was also a commercial venture, because a lot of industry at the time was dependent on whaling. And it was also often a means by which you could sail for free to California, and then you can abandon ship when you got to California to join in the gold rush that was going on. So again, think of the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and indeed prosperity, and you can see how that ties into the idea of the great American dream and therefore the great American novel. And what about the idea of the personal being political? So we have a multi-ethnic crew that exists in harmony at a time when the issue of slavery is coming to a head. Of course, because the American Civil War was, at least ostensibly, fought over that very thing. Now, there's a genuine friendship between Ishmael, the protagonist, and Queequeg, who is a Polynesian cannibal. Now, that does take time to blossom, because Ishmael is initially very afraid of him, but he learns to look beyond the surface, overcome his prejudice, and in so doing, the two of them share a common humanity, i.e. racial harmony. And then, of course, there's Ahab. Now, he has this pathological obsession with hunting down Moby Dick, and it makes him the ultimate literary representation of a sort of uncompromising fanaticism. His reckless pursuit of revenge dooms not only him, but the whole crew of the ship. Now, Ahab has been compared to many literary figures, from his namesake in the Old Testament through to Shakespeare, King Lear. Now, to draw Ahab directly with political concerns of the USA at the time, it can be read as a sort of warning against the single-minded pursuit of something that you think you want so badly, which is a charge that can be levied at the American dream as a whole, at the expense of being a decent, rational person. Right, so let's move on to The Age of Innocence now by Edith Wharton. Now, this novel is the whole idea behind this novel is very, very beautifully summed up by the quotes at the top here. They lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. This quote is a perfect summation of the artifice and stiffened convention of the straight-laced world that the characters of the novel operate in. It may be specifically about a particular time in a particular place, New York, in the USA, but the idea that all of us live unquestioningly attached to moral and social conventions and we do this because we are terrified at the prospect of breaking free of them, still holds true today, and indeed will probably still hold true in the future, because ultimately it's easier to look back on a past society's values and be critical of those than to turn that sort of critical analysis on the lens of the society that we live in today and that we hold. It's a lot easier to do that on other societies than it is to do on your own. So, The Age of Innocence. Now, like Moby Dick, it is a genre transcending in a sense that it's a historical novel, but only in the most basic sense of the word. Indeed, it explores how historicism resonates into the contemporary, as many of the characters are emblematic of those who have lived through more than multiple end of eras. The Age of Innocence, the idea of the Age of Innocence, now that refers to the time before World War One, and World War One was an experience that profoundly changed the outlook and worldview of those who lived before and after the war. They weren't the same people after the war as they were before them, because it was such a seismic, life-changing thing. And of course, they struggle to reconcile the two very different worlds that they've experienced pre-World War One and post-World War One. Now, the idea of there being two very different worlds plays out with the tension between those whose wealth comes from old money against those who come from so-called new money. Now, old money refers to those who've inherited their wealth. They're the established upper classes, and their wealth goes back generations. New money, on the other hand, is wealth that has been acquired within your own generation. So this sort of tension ties in with the obsession of keeping up appearances that happen in a novel. The preoccupations with staying up with the latest fashion trends, or being seen at the right parties, and so on. Now, this obsession with status symbols and being accepted by high society was certainly a preoccupation of the upper classes at this time. This was the zeitgeist that these characters were operating in. So, this is how the Age of Innocence captures the zeitgeist. And in terms of the personal as political, we have the focus on a love triangle. The central plot of the Age of Innocence is a love triangle between the three main characters: the protagonist, Newland Archer, his fiancée, May Welland, and the alluring other woman in this mix, Countess Ellen Olenska. Now, Newland's engagement to the sheltered May is a very respectable and conventional one. It's what's expected of him. Ellen, when she enters the equation, she kind of changes a lot because she's much more free-spirited and independent, and she does things her own way, a bit more unconventionally. And she is, with that, she's a big threat to the established idea of what a New York high society lady should be. Now, Newland's infatuation with Ellen as she appears on the scene not only threatens his marriage to May, but also causes him to question the values that he has been brought up on and taken for granted. So again, it's an exploration of the changing social forces and conventions, because where else could the effects of these upheavals and changes and threats to established high society traditions be felt more keenly than when it comes to love, when it comes to the affairs of the heart. Right, next one. We're going to move on to one that many of you will be familiar with, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby is a romantic story of Gatsby and his ill-fated, semi-requited love for the beautiful but shallow Daisy. But it's not just a romantic story, just like Age of Innocence before it. It's also a social commentary, as, for example, it details the gap between the haves and have-nots. So it might be set at the time of the Jazz Age and a roaring 20s, a time of happiness and plenty for many, or for some at least, but it certainly isn't for all. There are those who are marginalised on the outside looking in, who have a much more difficult time of it than the privileged do. One notable example, perhaps, being the downtrodden and despised mechanic George, and he, of course, has a fatal influence on the novel's denouement. In casting Jay Gatsby, as a fundamentally decent and generous man who is driven to be where he is today, and only throws extravagant parties to win the heart of Daisy. Incidentally, Gatsby is new money. We should add at this point to refer back to the Age of Innocence, whereas Daisy is old money. So in throwing these extravagant parties to win the heart of Daisy, making him the main character, and at the same time the initially optimistic but increasingly cynical and knowing Nick Carraway as the narrator, Fitzgerald can play them off against the more vapid characters such as Tom and Daisy and Myrtle. Gatsby and Nick, they represent bettering oneself and placing value in ideas, whereas the others represent being better than others and placing value in material things. Now, as far as this novel measuring the distance between the reality and the American dream goes, there is some dirt behind the daydream lifestyle of Gatsby. He's made his wealth on bootlegging, which is the illegal importing of alcohol. It's the basis of much of his fortune. But again, rather like the Age of Innocence, the glamorous cars, parties, and overall lifestyle are depicted as being ultimately very superficial and even artificial. The lives and worlds that much of the characters inhabit are very decadent, and they're very unsustainable. Rather like, those of you who studied the history would know this, rather like the boom period, roaring 20s themselves, where small government laissez-faire policies ultimately led to the Wall Street crash and economic depression, boom and bust. Now, we've just touched on how the characters are emblems of how there are different values that can be associated with the American dream. one critic said, and I don't want to get anyone's hackles up here, but one critic said that the way that society very much was at the time meant that women were financially dependent on men, and so sought them for their money, whereas men wanted women for their beauty as a status symbol by which they could maintain their status. So don't be too hard on the women of the novel, because they are products of their time. Okay, and remember, don't transpose our 21st century values onto a novel that was written over 100 years ago. Now, and then there's Nick. Of course, as I said, he gradually becomes disillusioned over the course of the novel, as the uglier side of the world that he's entered becomes ever more pronounced. And he's the only one of the principal characters to attend Gatsby's funeral, which drives the point home how superficial and false everyone else is. And he's thoroughly disenchanted by the end of the novel. It's a very mournful farewell, because the possibilities offered by the lifestyle of Gatsby are well and truly over. Okay, so the last one I'll talk about in depth is the eventually feel-good The Colour Purple now. I say eventually because it starts out very dark and glum, but I want to lay on a spoiler that it's got a happy ending. And the reason I want to do that is to show you that it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to the Great American Novel, which is, you might well have thought so far with the previous examples I discussed. So The Colour Purple is a coming-of-age story written in the form of letters, but it enters the realm of race and gender roles and relations, both in amongst the African American community at the turn of the 18th to 19th century, and its outward race relations with the white community. There are also LGBT elements in the narrative long before LGBT became fashionable in YA literature, and at a time when society as a whole was less accepting of LGBT than we are now. So it is a very brave novel on that basis. Last but not least, Africa, where the younger sister of protagonist Celie goes to undertake some missionary work, features prominently. And again, this is rather brave and unconventional. It subverts your expectations because it portrays Africa in many ways more favourably than the USA, which is certainly not the norm. In essence, Africa is, or at least the country that Nettie goes to, is portrayed as a place where a simpler lifestyle, less burdened by material expectation and wealth, two big things that packaged in the American dream, can lead to greater happiness. Simple equals more happiness, in other words. Now, the race issue is one that has haunted the USA throughout its history. Race relations, from slavery through to civil rights, and indeed through to the present day. Yes, of course, we've had our first black American president, but we all know all too well it's an ongoing issue, magnified, of course, by the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movements, which in itself, of course, let's not forget that was triggered by the murder of George Floyd. So, of course, the lot of African Americans today is nowhere near as bad as those experienced day to day by those in The Colour Purple, but issues of racism still do exist, and for that reason, The Colour Purple undoubtedly resonates through to today. And this is because, certainly at first, the characters of the novel, by and large, conform to society's expectations of them. So the prominent male characters in The Colour Purple, such as Albert, Celie's husband, and Albert's son Harpo, embody the patriarchal stereotype of being head of the household, and as such they attempt to assert their dominance over their wives with varying degrees of effectiveness. It's certainly this sort of masculine assertiveness. It certainly comes more naturally to Albert than it does to Harpo, but they are asserting this dominance over what they perceive to be the weaker gender because they themselves are subjugated and dominated by the white man. Now the women, meanwhile, are double down oppressed because both because of their race and their gender. Celie, the protagonist, is the most oppressed of all. She meekly accepts her lot, and because of this, she is ruthlessly exploited. And as such, when the novel starts, she seems to be in a totally hopeless position. But she does get out of it, largely by drawing upon the strength of other women, most notably the musician Shug Avery, who opens a world of possibilities to her, and this is the catalyst for her eventually reconnecting with her sister Nettie. So it is through not accepting the way things are and making small steps towards achieving the actual equality that is in the American, purported to be in the American Constitution, that Celie achieves happiness. And actually that applies to Harpo and eventually Albert when they realise that equality and not subjugation is the answer. So, in summary, after my pinpointing those four examples there, perhaps you think there actually is a great American novel that can stand toe-to-toe with the great epic works of European and Asian literature. Perhaps one of the ones I've talked about, or another one, will eventually come to be seen on such a level. But wherever you stand on the issue of the great American novel, it is a concept that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's an unkillable idea. So we've got this quote here: the likelihood of its thriving all the more vigorously under threat of national emergency or decomposition, insofar as hankering for the great American novel, bespeaks a continuing desire for vicarious participation. The very openness will help ensure that the great American lives on as fantasy, if not as achieved results. Now, what on earth is that saying? That is a horribly wordy sentence. But in essence, what's that saying? That the USA, it's a young country, it's a turbulent country that is determined to have its place on the world stage. It's determined to project an outward sense of pride and confidence. But underneath it all, it is perhaps less sure of itself for the reasons we've talked about here. It's a young, insecure country, and with that sort of complex sort of dual identity, the appeal of the great American novel will stay, because it is a literary healing balm that will help the nation understand itself. Okay, thank you very much for listening, everyone.